All right, Don, let's go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ross, and I am a professor of history at the University of Southern California. And I am also the Myron and Marion Casden Director of the USC Casden Institute for the study of the Jewish role in American life. And on behalf of the Casden Institute and our partner, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our Casden conversation featuring Professor Stephen Windmueller and Professor Dan Schnur, who are going to talk to us today on the 2020 elections, Jewish trends. Unfortunately, my co-partner and co-host in this, Rabbi Susan Nannis, can't be with us today, but she asked to extend her warm wishes and wishes for everyone to be healthy and safe over the next few months. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to very briefly, for those of you new to Casden events, touch on what we do. Our Casden Conversation Series aims to bring together students, faculty, and the community at large for more informal discussions that explore a wide range of contemporary topics that are at the forefront of American Jewish culture and American Jewish identity. And our goal from the start has been to shed light, not heat, on topics of relevance and interest. And I think our topic today is one of relevance and interests. If you're not on our mailing list, just Google Casden Institute, and we'd be glad to let you know of all upcoming events. A brief word on today's format. When we hold these in-person events at USC, they're usually 90 minutes on campus. But given Zoom fatigue, we hope to end today no later than 5:15. Our speakers are going to talk for roughly 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience. And if you have a question, please enter it into the chat function, and I will collect those questions and then pose them at the end to our panelists. One favor I request, please make your question short so we can get to as many people as possible. Today's speakers are Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College. And prior to coming to HUC, Dr. Windmueller had served on the staff of the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. And while at HUC, Stephen Windmueller served for 10 years as director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, and then as the school's dean. And between 2012 and 2014, he was invited to teach classes at USC and Nanjing University in China. Professor Windmueller is the author of 4 books and numerous articles. His research focuses on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. And during this pandemic crisis, Dr. Windmueller has been devoting his time and research to examining both the impact of the coronavirus on the American Jewish community and also election trends, both in the United States and in Israel. I'm also pleased to add that Dr. Windmueller is editing a volume for the USC's Casden Institute called Jewish Perspectives on the 2020 Elections, and that will be released a year from this December. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Our other panelist is Dan Schnur, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications, where he teaches courses in politics, communication, and leadership. Dan has also taught at the Kennedy School of Government and Institute of Politics at Harvard and at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He is also, for those of you who read the LA Times regularly, the co-founder or founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll, and currently hosts a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. And I would just remind the audience that Dan's poll was one of the most accurate polls 4 years ago. So I really want to hear what he has to say about what's going to happen 16 days from now. Welcome, Dan. Welcome, Stephen. And I turn the program over to the two of you.
Well, Steve, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to join you and the entire group here today. I think I speak for Stephen, at least on this point, perhaps not on any others, in which I tell you how glad we are to be here and how flattered we are to be asked to be part of any Casden Institute programming. And whenever we're able to join in, it's something we really benefit from. We hope everyone else will as well. Before we get started, just one quick correction to that very kind introduction, Steve. When I still ran the USC LA Times poll back in 2016, as I think many of our audience knows, it did show Donald Trump winning the election. But of course, in the interest of both accuracy and humility, that poll did not survey the Electoral College, but rather the popular vote. So while there were great insights learned from it, and perhaps Stephen and I will talk about some of them today, it was not accurate. And under the poll's current leadership, it appears that its findings throughout this year are somewhat in line with the rest of national polling being done. And wanted to set the record straight before we got started. But, and I guess one other correction I'll offer you, and this is for an audience in case there's anyone in the Zoom room today who is a LA Dodger fan. Not only will we try to be done by 5:15 p.m., we will be done by 5:15 p.m. Because like many of you, Stephen and I are both very interested in seeing that seventh game from the very first pitch. So rest easy. We are the first half of a doubleheader this afternoon and evening. So Stephen, with this, I think what you and I agreed on sounded like a lot of fun to me, and I hope our audience enjoys it also, is rather than having someone ask each of us questions, we just simply ask each other questions. And I won the coin flip, and I elected to kick. And so I get to ask you the first question, Stephen. And I guess where I'll start this is, for the past 4 years, we've watched this president talk, not only to Jewish audiences, but to other audiences as well, about what he considers to be very stalwart and aggressive support of the state of Israel. My question for you, not necessarily as it relates to Trump or to Biden, but more broadly, is for American Jews, where does Israel fit into the 2020 election? How important are issues relating to Israel in the Middle East to American Jewish voters?
First of all, thank you again to both Casden and to Wilshire Boulevard. And it's always a pleasure to be in dialogue with Dan Schnur. And indeed, as baseball fans, we stand ready to be the first half of a great evening of entertainment. The question, Dan, is really extraordinary because it, in many ways, is the abiding issue for certainly media's attention. Every time I'm interviewed by the general press, the initial issue is about Israel and American Jewish support. And of course, we know from every polling resource we have, Jews have a very deep and abiding interest in the state of Israel. But in the 2020 election, its place in the corollary or standards of key priorities actually is fairly low, which means that for many American Jews, Israel, which was once a 1 to 4 in terms of priority setting, priorities for Jews, in the 2020 election, we believe it is far less of a significant outcome. And this is based both on some polling data we've looked at, but also in the context that when America and Israel are not in crisis, either with one another or face a challenge from a threat external to Israel in the Middle East, the corollary response is that American Jews return to or seek out other issues that are prominent and prioritized for many of them. I should note that there are voters in the Jewish community, very important numbers of voters, who still place Israel as a high priority, even in this election. But in looking at the vast array of public opinion sentiment amongst Jewish voters, issues related to healthcare, immigration, the Supreme Court, gun violence, and a host of other issues are all ranking higher in 2020 than the particular concerns around Israel.
As I suspect is going to be our habit for the next half an hour or so, Stephen, I agree with you. And I'd add just a couple of points before we go on to the next topic. One is, some of you in the audience may know, I spent many years in Republican politics before switching my party registration to no party preference or independent about 10 years ago. And many people in my former party, Stephen, former elected officials and others, are often vexed that what they consider to be their party's steadfast support for Israel doesn't translate into more support at the polls. And I think you put your finger on one really important point, which is, absent a crisis, and let's be, we should be careful on this, because Israel at every moment faces some level of existential crisis. But I think where I'd add on to your point is something that becomes even more dire and immediate threat than exists on an ongoing basis. It tends to fall out, not fall out of the consciousness of American Jews, but to subside down to a level of import beneath the domestic policy issues that you mentioned. The other point that I try to make to Republicans on this is, I said, even for those American Jews to buy the argument that Republican party leaders have been more stalwart in their support of Israel, I said, it's not a black and white equation. It's not as if one party is incredible on Israel and the other party is terrible. So even if someone buys that premise, the difference between a party that's very, very, very good on Israel and one that's very, very, very good on Israel, that additional very might not be enough to offset the vast range of domestic policy issues on which most American Jews lean leftward. The second point I'd make quickly goes to your analysis that there are some pockets within the Jewish community that do rank Israel as a higher priority. One, of course, is Israeli-American expats. The other tend to be Orthodox Jews. And what I would say, as someone who used to be involved in the polling process, for very different reasons, those two groups tend to be a little bit harder to survey. And so while I don't know that it would fundamentally change the makeup of the types of numbers that both you and I look at, it is worth noting that at least two of the group of the cohorts within the broader Jewish American electorate do tend to lean a little bit left, a little bit rightward, and do tend to put a bit more emphasis on Israel and Middle Eastern related issues.
I would like to address for our next question what I guess we would both agree is the deep political divide that defines our nation as a whole, but more specifically in connection with the so-called Jewish divide. How problematic, Dan, do you see this for a minority community to exhibit such significant divisions when it's seeking to portray or present itself as unified around Israel and possibly other priorities?
Boy, whether you intended it or not, Stephen, it's not just one, but two excellent questions. One about the divide in the Jewish community, and one about the divide in the broader American electorate. And to start wide and then narrow, I'd say it should be of great concern to all of us as Americans, Jewish or otherwise, at how extraordinarily polarized and hyper-partisan our electorate has become. I tell my students at SC and at Cal and at Pepperdine, I can tell them about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working together to fix Social Security. I can tell them about Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton working together to balance the budget. And Stephen, I might as well be telling them about my favorite blacksmith. They don't doubt me, but it's just such a historical irrelevancy to the politics that they experience. My own theory, as I share with them, is I believe that politics is different than football, particularly relevant with the USC audience, of course. Politics is different in football in that in politics, victories tend to come in between the 40-yard lines. In that lost art of bipartisan cooperation and compromise, I think has created an extraordinary challenge for American society as a whole, but even greater, toward the point of your question, Stephen, toward the American Jewish community. We're 2% of the nation's population as it is, which means the Jewish community's ability to have impact relies on an unusual level of political involvement, which our community has shown for many years, but it also tends to rely on solidarity as well. And the more divided we are within the community, all we're really doing is dividing our potential impact and influence in half. Now, I'm not suggesting either within the Jewish community or within the American electorate writ large that we simply ignore legitimate differences of policy and philosophy between those on the left and those on the right. But what I do think is a lost art, both for the broader American electorate and for our community as well, is we're not quite as talented at finding that common ground as we once were. And as important as that is for the broader American electorate, I think it's of even greater import for a community of the size of ours that has such an important role to play in the political and governing processes.
I would add that as the American Jewish community has sort of moved in its maturing years, that is, we are now a part of this country since its inception. So as part of that, we have taken on the attributes, political and otherwise, that in many ways define the kinds of diversities we see across the political spectrum. So why should we expect of American Jews a kind of performance that somehow runs counter to the behaviors we see elsewhere in the political arena? And the other point is the vast sort of diversified voting behavior of American Jews, which is really quite fascinating. I mean, we have on the left, the red diaper babies, the great grandchildren of the socialist movement on one hand. And then we have the independent urbanites, that is young millennials who are Bernie supporters and who have increasingly been expressing a kind of independence from the traditional Democratic Party platform and candidates. And we saw that, by the way, in Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016, when between 8 and 10% of Jewish millennials did not vote because Bernie wasn't on the ticket. So they exercised this notion of their independence. So what we're actually observing is a kind of an Americanization of Jewish political behavior as exemplified by these kinds of examples.
And of course, we can get more into this in greater detail a little bit later, should our audience care to. But that lack of motivation from the progressive base of the Democratic Party was ultimately, of course, fatal to Hillary Clinton's campaign. What I try to remind people is that for young people in the year 2016, whether Jewish young people or otherwise, is that if you were under the age of 30 in 2016, you had never voted in a presidential election that had been won by a Republican. So while theoretically it was a possibility, it was something from a previous era that parents and grandparents dealt with, and it was never going to happen again in our modern times. And of course, the outcome of the 2016 shook many of those young people greatly. And they vowed in December of 2016 to never make that same mistake again. And of course, one of the greatest challenges that Joe Biden faces 4 years later is doing everything he and his campaign can do to motivate those voters, many of whom seem willing to make that same decision again. But let's move on, because I want to ask you another question about the 2016 campaign, since we're now on that topic. And maybe we can broaden for just a minute or two, not just to talk about the American Jewish portion of the electorate, but more broadly. One of the things that struck me from 2016, and you and I have talked about it, Stephen, and I know you feel the same way, is long-term trends in voter distrust toward government, toward politics and to politicians seemed to crest in 2016. It didn't appear out of magically, but this had been something been growing for a long time. When people don't trust their government, when they don't trust their elected leaders, what does that say about the state of American democracy? And just not to move too far afield from our topic at hand, does that have any particular consequences for the American Jewish community when that lack of trust continues to grow?
Yes, as you and I have chatted, certainly the issue of trust is a central piece to the American Jewish story. we have been deeply committed as voters, activists, candidates, commentators on the political scene, and more recently as major funders to candidates and causes. So the reality is that the Jewish community is perceived as very much aligned with the institutions of government and the practice of politics. When this begins to collapse across the American spectrum, as we've noted in 2016 and beyond, this is really challenging to the whole sort of construct of democracy. What does that mean? And what might it mean? Should people lose faith in the political process, in voting, or in their elected officials? And what is deeply troubling are the polling data with regard to trust in the institutions of government and trust in leadership. And this has been particularly significant in the course of the past 4 years. And I point to this as really the base point upon which I have been urging American Jewish institutions to really invest in community relations and intergroup relations and civic engagement, because I believe that is one of the roles that the communal system that we have created can help to play in strengthening the core elements of governance and government.
Boy, I really want to come back to that topic a little bit later, which is what we should be doing as a community to build and strengthen our ties with other communities. One of the fun things I get to do is, in addition to the webinar that Steve was nice enough to mention earlier, is once a month I host a webinar on behalf of the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles called Building Bridges. And we have representatives from the Jewish community, the African-American community, the Latino, and the Asian Pacific community talking about issues of mutual concern in a way that, in conversations that haven't taken place as frequently or as meaningfully as they may have in previous eras. And I do want to come back to that. But before we go on, I do want to pick up on one point you made about lack of trust, and maybe to put an exclamation point on it as it relates to our community. We as a Jewish community know, either ourselves or our parents or grandparents, what happened when large numbers of frightened and angry people in an unsettled society look for people to blame for their fears and anger. Far too often, that anger turns toward us. I believe, and you'd have a better sense of this than I would, that historically, one of the primary motivations for the American Jewish community to work so hard to become involved in American governance at every level of politics and government, local, state, and national, is in order to do everything we can to avoid those kind of horrible experiences in this society. And when people become so fearful and so angry that they begin to distrust the political establishments with which we have worked so hard to build relationships, that is the potential to put us in very great danger again. And I know we'll get to this later, but the rising levels of anti-Semitism in this society, to me, are directly related, inversely, to the declining levels of trust in American government and other institutions.
Our next question is precisely on topic with this conversation. When you think, Dan, about the behaviors we may experience following the November 3rd election, what are some of the post-election issues we need as American Jews to be thinking about and to be concerned about?
Well, and it's a great question, not just for American Jews, but Americans, because while I believe, and we can talk about this later, should our audience like, I do believe that ultimately that the election, and if the election result is for a transfer of power, that transfer will take place in a peaceable way. I do believe there'll be some pretty severe bumps in the road between here and there. I think one of the most important things for all of us to remember and remind others, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, members of our community, is that election day this year might not be election day. And it's very possible that our election will not be resolved as we've become accustomed to in a television internet era. Our election may not be settled on the evening of November 3rd and could turn into election week or even election month. Our Secretary of State here in California refers to this as election season. And I have to believe that anyone who tunes into a conversation with you and I on a Sunday afternoon, Stephen, is already very aware of the likelihood of that possibility. But according to public opinion polling, a sizable plurality of our fellow Americans are not aware of that. And between 25 and 30% of Americans have said that they're not aware that the election results might take more than a day or days to come in. So the one thing I'd urge on everyone here, no matter how many times you've heard it through mass media, through programs like these, is to make sure that people you know who don't pay as close attention to these discussions as you, pass on that information so there can be as little panic and as little unrest as possible. I'm very concerned that even with those efforts, that there may be on election day and the days after, real disruptions, hopefully not violent, but certainly the possibility for significant unrest. And as we talked about just a moment ago, when those types of emotions come to the forefront in a frightened or angry portion of society, it's often our community that bears the brunt of this. I think the best thing for all of us is to make sure that as broad as large a percentage of the electorate understands that this election might take longer than normal. I think the best thing for us to do on election day is set examples, to demonstrate calm, to exhibit confidence in the system. Because just like panic is contagious, so is confidence and calm as well. And the fewer people and the more isolated there are who choose to act out in an inappropriate way on November 3rd or the days beyond, the less impact they'll have.
I'll invite you to ask the next question.
Okay. So this is something you and I have talked about for years, Stephen, and it's something I just really enjoy hearing your thoughts on. You know, the scholar Milton Himmelfarb of the American Jewish Committee, years and years ago, back in the 1970s, offered a wonderful and quotable assessment of American Jewry. And he said, quote, "Jews live like Episcopalians, but vote like Puerto Ricans," quote unquote. Well, I guess my question for you is, here we are almost half a century after Himmelfarb offered that famous assessment. Is that still the case, or are we seeing changes? And if there are, in what other trends might we be watching for in this year's election season?
In some measure, we are the same, and in other ways, we are very radically different. For sure, we have seen the emergence of the American Jewish voter as a far more complex voter, in the sense that his liberalism or his conservatism take on additional influences and meanings, have been impacted by history and by events and by the socialization of American Jews. Look, the exit polling on the 2016 election had Hillary Clinton receiving 71% of the Jewish vote, Donald Trump receiving 24%. And whatever the numbers will be this go around, it is quite evident that overwhelmingly American Jews will be supporting the Democratic candidate, Joseph Biden. But what is also fascinating is the number of new voters entering this election. And that's not simply limited or speaking to the Jewish component of that, but literally 20 million new American voters. 1 million voters are added on a regular basis. We will have 20 million new voters for 2020 for their first time. Most of these folks, many of them, will be people of color, reflecting the diversity and the changing character of the American populace. The other interesting element here, having to do specifically with the Jewish voting constituency, is the rise of a significant and growing block of Orthodox voters, both here in the United States and Americans who have made Aliyah to Israel, who still have certainly the capacity and right to vote in the American elections. The reality of the American voter over these 50 years is that we are today the oldest white establishment voting bloc in the country, which means that of all the religious communities, of all the ethnic and racial communities in the United States, Jews are older by significant percentage points over other cultures and communities. And that reflects in part some of the changing behaviors and concerns of the Jewish voters, the tendency to vote for healthcare, concerns about Social Security, and concerns about related issues that deal specifically with senior considerations, senior aging considerations, is an important reality to where our voters are in 2020. So yes, in many ways we retain our liberalism. In some ways we show our aging, and in still other ways we are welcoming and seeing new infusions of voters, both Jewish and non-Jewish.
Yeah. And I think the only thing I'll add to that before we go on is to spend a little bit more time talking about the other end of the generational spectrum. Almost 1/3 of the vote this year, just roughly 30% of the vote this year, is going to be cast by millennials or Generation Z voters. And I think while the overall breakdown within the Jewish community, roughly a 3-to-1 margin, a few percentage points in one direction or the other, is likely to remain consistent this year, within both parties, I think that generational change is going to cause some very important trends that are worth keeping an eye on. And I see that Marilyn Alper asked a really smart question in the chat room, relating to something we were talking about earlier and just revisited, that is the overall vote balance between Republican and Democrat presidential candidates this year. She asked if there's any difference because Biden is known as a consistent supporter of Israel in that overall calculation. And I don't know if you would disagree with me, Stephen, but I would say, Marilyn, probably not. Because I was saying earlier, most American Jews view both parties to be very good on Israel. And the fact that Biden shows what many American Jews consider to be a consistent record probably reinforces that roughly 3/4 level of support, but probably doesn't increase it, if only because President Trump has taken some very high profile stances that many people, not just Republicans, but others, would argue strongly have been to the benefit of the state of Israel. Back to the generational thing real quick. I got a little bit sidetracked, Stephen. So you have this tremendous influx of young voters at the same time that the Jewish community vote ages. And again, in terms of partisan balance, that probably doesn't make a lot of difference. But I encourage you to think about the changes that reflects within the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party is turning leftward in a very aggressive way, in a way that we haven't seen in many, many years. We've watched Biden struggle with this to some degree. Many progressives at the base of the Democratic Party, mainly young people and voters from communities of color, who've been dissatisfied with the more centrist approach that Biden has taken in this campaign. And we saw this week that California Senator Dianne Feinstein, who has been a pillar of the American Jewish community and American Jewish politics for decades, has come under very harsh criticism from progressives for the way she conducted herself during the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett over the last several days. That's a separate conversation in itself, but it is a reflection about how rapidly the electorate is changing. And even if the overall partisan balance doesn't shift appreciably, the trends within the two parties is something that's important for us to keep an eye on going forward.
In moving forward, I think that this high profile of American Jews in politics, whether as candidates, as funders, as activists, which we've spoken about, are you concerned that this high profile status contributes to a problem in terms of how Jews are perceived in the community and beyond our community?
Well, we are seeing growing examples, of course, of anti-Semitism and overt hostility on both an individual and organizational basis. And some of this reflects back on the generational shifts that we were talking about just a moment ago. But Stephen, I don't think the answer to that greater threat is to lower our level of involvement. Just the opposite. I think the best protection we can have against those hostilities and resentments is to be as integrally involved as possible. So while the higher profile, in terms of the types of engagement you talked about, may contribute to some degree, I would say that the benefits of that engagement far outweigh the downsides, so long as, like we both talked about earlier, we as a community are willing to become more engaged in conversations with other underrepresented communities, in addition to our more traditional political involvement.
It's particularly interesting to note that a conversation has developed around the fact that American Jews are such major funders of political causes and candidates. And a study that suggests that 1/2 of all dollars raised by the Democratic Party come from Jewish sources, and 1/4 of all funds raised by Republicans are generated by Jewish sources, contributes to this further profiling that this question suggests, and raises, of course, all the traditional anxieties associated with anti-Semitism and the high profile of Jewish financial power. Let's move on, however.
Let's agree that it's almost time for us to end this duopoly on the conversation and bring Steve back, as well as smart questions from our audience. But before we do, I want to ask you one last question, and it plays off of a point we were discussing just a moment ago. Over the last several months in America, in Los Angeles and in cities across the country, we have been experiencing a racial reckoning of the type that has not taken place in the US in many, many years. Some of the protests have been peaceful. Some of the conversations have been productive. Some of the protests and conversations less so. So I guess the question I would ask you, Stephen, before we broaden the conversation, is given this period of, again, for lack of a better term, racial reconciliation and racial reckoning, how should our community engage in this discussion? More specifically, how should we understand and relate to the Black Lives Matter movement? And how should we involve ourselves in the conversation of racial injustice?
This is a conversation for a whole seminar, and certainly for another Wilshire Casden afternoon conversation. But it is focused on the clear issue that the Black Lives Matter movement needs to be addressed and is being addressed by various parts of our community. 26 million Americans this summer were on the streets, and literally thousands of American Jews were part of that expression. Numerous Jewish organizations have already begun to weigh in, no doubt, on pieces of the Black Lives Matter agenda. What is confusing and sometimes disruptive is the fact that the movement for Black lives has created a kind of ideology and national coalition of policy. And that, in many measures, has driven criticism and raised issues for American Jews. But the irony is that the Black Lives Matter structure itself is very much organized, localized, and is a series of chapters and individual expressions of different agendas that the Black community is raising. So the first job of the Jewish community is to sort out who's speaking, what are the issues we find comfortable and can work with, who are the players that are both responsive and a part of a coalition that we can feel able to join and connect with. And finally, that we need to be able to push back against those voices where we disagree and where we don't find common ground. So it is not as if one embraces an entire movement. It is rather to embrace particular issues that are important to America, to the governance of this society, and to the welfare of minorities across the board.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more strongly, Stephen. One of the things that I think we've all learned through these Building Bridges programs that the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles has sponsored this year, and by the way, our next one will be the Wednesday morning after the election on November 4th, with representatives from the Jewish Committee for Justice, from the LA Urban League, from the organization Hispanos, Organized for Political Equality, and the organization Cause, Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. One of the things I think we've all discovered, all four communities in these conversations, is that none of us are monoliths. The African-American community is not uniform in its beliefs any more than the Latinx community, the Asian Pacific community, or ours is. So there's an old joke in politics that I used to like to tell back in my campaign days. Yeah, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And the question about how do you engage with a movement in any of these communities or others that is so broad and so diverse and so diffuse, rather than saying, well, we simply can't because there isn't a single leader to talk to. You talk to as many people as you can, and you form relationships where you can. And if you eat that elephant one bite at a time, ultimately you end up where you need to, as opposed to saying, it's too big, it's too sprawling, we don't know what to do, so we're not going to do anything. Well, Stephen, once again, you and I have managed to convince each other on any number of topics. Perhaps this is a good time to bring Steve back into the conversation, and I see the questions are starting to come into the chat function. And let's turn this two-way conversation into a multi-way discussion. But Steve is on mute, so we're not able to hear him yet.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so we have a lively audience who aren't just sitting back, but let me start. I'm putting together some questions, but let me start with the broad one first. The title of our session today is the 2020 Elections Jewish Trends. What are the Jewish trends that you have seen so far? And I know, Stephen, you've written about this, and you've written about the, well, not so recent now, the Pew Trust polls in Israel and here. What are the trends that you see in the Jewish community? Because at one glance, it seems that the Jewish community is more divided than it ever has been, both in 2016 and 2020. Is it more divided, or is this just what we've not paid attention to before?
I think it's the continuation of the existing divide. It points to the sharpness around which the 2020 campaign is built, which is really around the president himself, his personality, his agendas, and his policies. It is framed in the Jewish community around the divides that we see and have described in this conversation and elsewhere in terms of the revitalization of Republican Jews who support the president, of never Trump Republicans who oppose him, of Democrats who are both centrist and embrace Joe Biden, and others who are progressives who have a more difficult time imbibing and supporting the Harris-Biden ticket. What we see as well is a pressure on the Jewish community from the right and the left, the alt-right and its expressions of critique of Jewish whiteness and Jewish claims to power, and from the left of folks who attack Israel and the BDS campaign that they support, are ways by which we see the Jewish community bombarded for the first time, both left and right, in the kind of political foray that the 2020 election provides. We also see that Jewish voters, in especially the bagel states are those states in play: Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, certainly Arizona, Texas, and several other states. These voters, including certainly Florida, are the Jewish voters whose votes are actually in play. And because they account for important outcomes in the 2020 election, we see this in particular attention to these types of Jewish constituencies. And finally, what we see in this campaign is the extraordinary presence of Jewish candidates and funders. Candidates across the board for Senate, for House, for state seats in large numbers. We saw this first in 2018, and we are seeing it again in 2020. We're seeing a Jewish candidate running for Senate in Alaska and has a chance to win. We see this in a Wyoming Senate race where an Israeli-American woman is running and doing reasonably well in a highly Republican state. And we see it in Georgia, where we have several Jewish candidates running in the senatorial races. We see Republican Jews running against Democratic Jews in Florida, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And we see in a variety of other elections, the high profile of young Jewish activists, both financially and politically, being engaged.
Steve, I don't know that there's much I can add to that comprehensive and very smart overview that Stephen has offered. Just the one brief thing I'd offer to build on one of his points is the polarization, the incredible dichotomy, both in the Jewish community and more broadly in the electorate. And I see there's a smart and reasonable question from Ron Margolis in our chat box that asks if the current president's neutral at best stance toward white nationalists and ultra-right Jews affect the trend in the Jewish vote. And the answer, Ron, just like my previous answer to Marilyn's question, is not really. Because just like in the overall American electorate, both sides are so dug in that there's almost nothing that can move votes in either direction. And while I don't presume to vote for, to speak for supporters of either President Trump or Vice President Biden, what I do hear quite a bit from Trump supporters in answer to a question or a challenge like yours is they point out that there are anti-Semitic threats that arise both from the far fringes of the right, but also from the far fringes of the left. And going back to a point that both Stephen and I made earlier, because Trump supporters in the Jewish community do tend to place a much larger priority on issues related to the state of Israel, that domestic policy, even an issue like this one, is less likely to affect their vote, particularly because they do perceive the anti-Semitic threats coming from the far end, from both far ends of the political spectrum.
We have another question that's interesting. I think as I'll read it. As a baby boomer, my experience is that my Republican friends do not consider Biden a longtime supporter of Israel. Additionally, the further we get away from World War II, the more supportive of the Palestinian cause the younger generations have become. Do we see an age divide in the Jewish community then?
There is some evidence from polling data that there is a divide on Israel amongst younger and older Jews. It is not that younger American Jewish voters and activists are not interested in or committed to Israel. It is that they are more distant from its political system, its political leadership, its policies that have been rendered. Older American Jews and religious Jews, meaning the more religiosity a Jewish voter has, Orthodox, conservative, and reform, the higher degree of allegiance, connection, and commitment to the state of Israel and certainly its political institutions. So yes, to the issue of the divide that is evident and may be reflective in some of the voting patterns that we are looking at.
And what I will add to that, Steve, is Stephen is right that younger Jews tend to be further distant from the Israeli government and Israeli leadership. I think it's also worth noting that they're much further from Israel's founding. And they're much further from the types of threats that Israel faced in its first quarter of a century of existence. And that while today's threats are of great concern, obviously, I think we could all agree they're a much different type of threat. So look, I am, my first memories of Israel as a young person are 1967 and 1963, or 1973, excuse me. For a young Jewish student at USC or Cal or another college or university today, their first memories are a very different type, are of a very different type of experience. Israel had a much different role in the world and in the global conversation. And so this is less related to the 2020 election, but a longer term challenge for the Jewish community that to Rabbi Nanis's credit, that Wilshire Boulevard has hosted a number of conversations on, and Steve, I know you and your colleagues at Casden have as well, which is how does Israel, how does our American Jewish community develop greater levels of support for Israel among the youngest American Jews? And it will be a much greater challenge because instead of being alive for the state of Israel's founding, instead of being alive for the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, hearing about it from parents or grandparents is a different type of emotional experience. I've been very proud over the years. I've been the faculty advisor at different times for both Trojans for Israel and SC Students for Israel. And what I will tell you is that the overwhelming majority of the presidents of both organizations during the time I've worked with them have been young leaders from the Persian Jewish community. And I would suggest that because the Persian Jewish experience in America is one generation less removed than the European Ashkenazic experience, that you do tend to see a greater level of motivation among those from the Persian Jewish community. There's exceptions to that. There's an extraordinary woman by the name of Rose Rich, who was our Trojans for Israel's president last year, who I think all of you are familiar with. And I don't want to suggest for a moment that European and Ashkenazic Jews on campus are not actively involved on behalf of Israel. But I think what we, as the older generations of the American Jewish community, have to recognize and have to accept is that because every generation is one further removed from Israel's founding and early challenges, it will require a different approach for their generation than for mine in order to build that support. And I think far too often we end up trying to cram a generational square into a generational round hole. How's that for a tortured metaphor?
So since we're talking about generations, another question we had is, so what are Jewish communities around the country doing to engage younger voters in this election, regardless of political affiliation? I just got a phone call from my temple today urging me to go out and vote. But to what extent are Jewish communities getting that group of young voters who don't vote to vote?
I'll just say quickly, and then I'll leave it to you, Stephen, if I can.
Yeah, I think the institutional Jewish community is very involved in trying to do exactly what happened in terms of your phone call today, which is to mobilize, organize, and recruit voters to fully participate. The challenge for the community, of course, is that many younger millennials and Gen Zs are not necessarily connected to the core traditional or established institutions of the community. So this then becomes a task for Hillel and other institutions that are in the gap roles that perform and assist younger Jews, whether it's Moshe House, Birthright Israel, or a whole host of other infrastructures that are attuned to the fact that turning out the voters, which we did not see in 2016, is an important and essential piece of the responsibility of community organizing.
And the only thing I would add to that is I will expect, Steve and Stephen, that the turnout among young Jews in this election will be very, very high, but will be for reasons having little or nothing to do with the organized Jewish community. What do we know about voter turnout? We know that better educated Americans tend to turn out in larger numbers than those with less education. We know that those with higher incomes tend to turn out in higher levels than those with lower incomes. We know, most importantly, that those young people who come from a household in which at least one adult is a regular voter are much, much more likely to vote than young people who don't grow up in a home where the adults in that household either choose not to vote or are not permitted to vote. So if you take those three demographic indicators among several others, young Jews will turn out in great numbers for all sorts of socioeconomic and demographic reasons. But for the most part, they'll turn out because of other prompts from outside the Jewish community, which means that issues relating to the Jewish community in Israel will be much smaller motivators in how they cast their ballot.
We find that approximately 85% of eligible Jewish voters vote. I mean, this is extraordinary. And in the Omaha Jewish community study, that number was 95%. And in several other studies, we've seen anything from 72% higher. Simply anointing or pointing to the value added that Jewish communal engagement is something that is sort of family bred and community encouraged in terms of this voting model.
One of the audience members asked us to comment on Barry Weiss's recent article on the rise of anti-Israel voices in the Democratic Party. And they asked, why has there been no recognition of this trend by Jewish leadership, either inside or outside the Democratic Party? Or has there been a recognition, and why hasn't there been more done to sort of temper those voices?
Stephen, I'm going to defer to you on this one and then weigh in the aftermath, if I may.
Sure. Barry Weiss's articles are particularly important, and as recently as this week, she has a new piece in which she basically is speaking to the kind of cancel culture philosophies that we are seeing to the cultural wars that are being engaged, to the minimization of distinctiveness, of Jewish distinctiveness as a way to, in a sense, create a kind of McCarthyism of behavior on the left. Her arguments deserve a significant amount of attention and conversation. The best I can suggest in this moment that we have to give to this is to say that the Jewish community is concerned about the issues of anti-Israelism and the kind of demonizing that has been taking place with the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel expression. And that has been expressed on the efforts by the Anti-Defamation League in much of its work, and by other organizations in terms of calling to the table or calling account to folks who seek to minimize and dismiss distinctive Jewish agendas and Jewish causes as being insignificant or problematic. This is a conversation that needs to be held as the Jewish community struggles with this battle between the progressive voices we're seeing inside the Democratic Party and the mainstream party. And this will be a war that will be in the trenches for the next number of years. I am of the mind that there will be targeting of Jewish candidates who are in the Senate and in the House, who are perceived as being sort of the voices of the established Jewish community. And they will be targeted as people to be removed. And this will be an internal battle inside the Democratic Party that the Jewish community and others will need to weigh in as we move beyond 2020.
Steve, it's a great question. And to me, to a large extent, it's a bookend of the question that I read earlier from Ron Margolis about potential threats from the right. I think we as a community need to recognize that on the right, nativism can become anti-Semitism very easily, just as on the left, virulent anti-Zionism can become anti-Semitism. And this goes back to a question that Stephen put to me earlier in this program about the divides in our community. I teach my students about a concept called selective outrage. And selective outrage, particularly in a highly polarized environment, means that I am much more willing to forgive excesses of someone on my side, while I harshly condemn those same excesses from someone on the other side of a philosophical or partisan divide. And if we as a community are going to be successful at confronting those challenges and those threats, both from the left and the right, none of us have the luxury of selective outrage. And for those of us whose political and ideological sympathies tend to learn leftward, we need to be willing to call out those on the left who allow and who provoke anti-Zionist messages to turn into anti-Semitism. And those of us whose philosophies and partisan leanings head rightward need to be willing to do the same on the right. And right now I've noticed that with precious few exceptions, our community is unwilling to do so. Weiss's question particularly is about the left, of course, and what I'll just simply say is to go back to a point that we both made earlier. We as a Jewish community did such an extraordinary, exemplary job for so many years of developing and strengthening and fostering relationships with underrepresented communities. And somewhere over the last generation, those efforts haven't disappeared, but they've withered. And somehow or other, and I don't pretend for a moment that these Building Bridges programs that we do are the answer. Maybe they're a very small part of it. We as a community need to recommit ourselves to having conversations with those who've been most willing to judge us harshly in recent years, even when it makes us philosophically or ideologically uncomfortable.
You know, we have two messages here that sort of, I think, raise similar points. One, it's basically essentially, what role has George Soros played in his support of J Street in splitting the Jewish allegiance to Israel? And what role has AOC played in her, reluctance to denounce any kind of anti-Semitic statements, and in fact make some that others have accused of being anti-Semitic. These are two people who seem to have split Jews in very different ways. You want to comment on that?
Dan, I'll let you start.
Sure. Soros, of course, is a almost perfect personification of the trends we've been talking about earlier. If you lean to the left, you either embrace him or minimize him. If you lean to the right, you are outraged and furious at all that he represents. J Street was a historical inevitability. And some might find that to be a good thing, some might find it to be a bad thing. I'll let each of you decide for yourselves. But going back to the point I was making earlier, as long as we, as Boomer and Generation X Jews, continue to pretend that the best way to build support for Israel among Millennials and Generation Z Jews is the same way that it worked for us back in the 1970s and 80s, a J Street organization and a leftward movement, even within the Jewish community, that is much more suspicious toward Israel's leadership and much more accommodating to the Palestinians, was inevitable, and will continue. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez represents a portion of the future of the Democratic Party. I remember 2 years ago, Jerry Nadler dismissing AOC and a few other newly elected voices in the Democratic Congressional Caucus is just 4 or 5 people. Nothing to be concerned about. And I will tell you, as a former Republican, that when a hostile cohort gains a toehold in your party, it very rarely goes away, it grows. And for those of us who remember a Republican Party that was much broader, more broad-based ideologically than the current version, we were told too that those most virulent nativist voices were just a very small portion of the Republican Party and were nothing to worry about. And ultimately, the American Jewish community needs to understand, particularly the very large majority of it that votes Democratic, realizes that this is a pronounced threat to the bipartisan approach to Israel that our community has fostered for many, many years. And the way to overcome that threat is not by war, but through conversation and mutual understanding of a type that simply hasn't existed, which leads far too many young progressive leaders to grow up in any community thinking of Israel as the enemy and as American Jews as the domestic representation of that enemy.
Well, I think this might be a good time to stop. And I want to thank Stephen Windmueller. I want to thank Dan Schnur. I also want to thank people behind the scenes, Don Levy, who has run our technical support on the last 2 events, and Rabbi Susan Nanis from Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and Lisa Ansell from the Casden Institute. And most of all, I want to thank the audience for attending. We have a steady group that hasn't dropped out. And I do want to make one announcement for those of you who are interested. There will be another Zoom tomorrow. If you look at your front page of the LA Times, there's a piece today on the controversy that happened this summer at USC. Several of us have pulled together and we have organized a series of panels called Stronger Than Hate at USC. And the one tomorrow at 5 o'clock is going to be anti-Semitism at USC, past and present. You can go onto the USC calendar, or if anyone out there wants to simply email me at sjross@usc.edu, I will send you a link to the session tomorrow. Thank you all for attending today. Thank our panelists, and please go out and vote and take one person with you who wasn't planning to vote in the next 16 days.